meeting will come to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is the Saline City Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, June 28th. Will the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young.
Here.
Carroll.
Here.
Fosdick. Here. Morrow. Absent. Gearbaugh.
Here.
Cole. Here. Beardsley. Absent. Heft. Absent. Troika.
Here.
Staff present tonight are Community Development Director Harrington and Recording Secretary Katnick. Is there a motion on the table to approve the agenda as distributed?
I move. I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes of June 14th, 2023 as submitted?
I move. I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Okay, seeing no public comments, the only item on our agenda tonight is discussion item number 1, accessory dwelling units. We had discussed this at our June 14th meeting, and we were hoping to come back and have additional discussion. So here we are. Ben, would you like to
Absolutely, I can kick it off. So at your March 22nd meeting, you recommended approval of the ordinance, the excerpts before you essentially, to the City Council. The City Council had concerns that perhaps the Planning Commission had not adequately considered the change in the accessory structure standards to allow accessory structures in all districts, not just limited to the R2, to be up to 24 feet in height or the size of the house, whichever is less. That information was included to you. That aspect of the ordinance has not changed since its inception. It was talked about at length at the Code Review's meeting, specifically on height when this ordinance was going through. However, it was omitted by accident in my report, and I can see in Planner Auerbach's report that it could be worded somewhat confusingly. So essentially, we're bringing it back as discussion as, did you understand this as an aspect of the ordinance, and or do you think that you need to reconsider it as a Planning Commission because of this caveat that you may or may not have been aware of it? So with that, I would just send it back to you and then see if we can develop some sort of consensus about whether this needs to be brought back or whether it can continue forward to City Council.
If it gets brought back, will it be to Planning Commissioner or will it go all the way back to Code Review?
I am very confident that Code Review is very aware of what this ordinance was, considering this is an item that we talked about at length at one of our Code Review meetings about height and that aspect of it for the R2. And Planner Auerbach and I informed them that this would have implications for the entire community, not just the R2 district.
Okay. Yes.
And I want to make it clear that Code Review has no authority in setting policy or any of that authority. They are only a review. All the information that was presented and reviewed by them is only on the basis of recommendation. It is not anything which we would necessarily skip over and not have this board adequately review it. That's why when it comes here, goes to council. If council has questions, it comes back to this group to be reviewed. The reason why I brought this up is because there was no discussion or concern related to the potential of having a 1,400 square foot building on a lot less than 8,000 square feet without any changes to the setbacks that we currently have for auxiliary units. My other question is, are you only allowed one auxiliary building or are you allowed more than one?
All right. So just to make sure that we're all on the correct vocabulary here, it is not fair to classify these buildings as 1,400 square feet because by our code, they are not 1,400 square feet building. A 2-story, 700 square foot building is a 2-story, 700 square foot building, and whether or not they fully utilize 700 square feet on that second floor is more or less irrelevant. They're taller structures, not larger, and that is a literal important definition. They're also accessory structures as opposed to auxiliary, which is another conversation that we can have. So yes, under the current code provisions and under the new proposed code revisions, you'd be allowed one accessory building over 200 square feet, up to 24 feet in height or the height of the house, whichever is less. And you'd be allowed one 200 square foot or less accessory structure that is less than 14 feet in height. So you would be allowed up to two detached accessory structures on your property, one over 200 square feet and one less. The larger one can be the height of the house or less,
So-
or 24 feet.
Do we have clear standards on when you have to go through a permit process for an accessory structure less than 200 square feet?
Yes, you're always supposed to pull a permit for it. Now, if someone essentially gets a prefabbed shed that's 40 square feet and we don't find out about it, we're not actively hunting, people's prefabbed 40 square foot sheds that they get from Home Depot or Lowe's, essentially. But in theory, yes, you're required to get a permit for it because it does have a lot coverage implication.
But the sheds aren't living.
Correct, the sheds, so yes, the sheds would not be livable, that is correct. They're just sheds. I also think it might help to share some permitting information because I think there's also some sort of hyperbole surrounding what people might do should we grant this. In the last 23 years, the city of Saline has issued 15 permits for detached garages, 15 for the remodel or enlargement or construction of detached garages. We've issued 10 shed permits in the last 23 years, which I think is more to that first point there, that people buy these prefab sheds and don't tell us about them, so we don't know. And we've issued one other permit for an accessory structure. It was a pergola that was over 200 square feet in the last 23 years.
And because we don't allow that, that's the reason why some of that happens. Now we're going to change our policy that would allow you to build, if you have a house that's 2 stories, a building on an 8,000 square foot or less, you could build a 24 by 30 foot building and then also put a second floor on it without adjusting for any other setbacks that we currently require. You could have a building on one side that already pre-exists, and you could build yours with 3 feet from the line. The other building is only 10 feet from the line, and it's like, we had this issue, and it was a ZBA concern with the property that was on Hollywood, similar issue where the building existed and the deck was going to build into the setbacks, and it was granted. I know that this is proposed to basically try and avoid requesting variances in the future, but it's also putting the cart before the horse because this is now going to allow buildings to be constructed that could potentially become auxiliary dwelling units if we allow it to roll out into our one area. The solution, or potentially on this one, could be is that we only try this out now and only allow it in an R2 area, and that way, which was really what council and even this group has talked about, has been R2. We've not talked about expanding everything into R1. My concern, again, and it's up to this group to decide what happens with it. I mean, I've been told that I am trying to derail this as a single member of council by the city manager, which is completely inaccurate and a misstatement. And I want to make it clear that this is being done because it was something that was not discovered or adequately discussed. And so at this point in time, we need to understand, do we want to be able to have, in like Rolling Meadows or anything else, these units to be able to have a 10 by 12, 10 by 20 auxiliary building, or a 10 by 12, and then also have a 24 by 30, which potentially could then become a 2-story building, all on one lot. That's a significant amount of structures on a property that we've never done in the past. And so moving forward, this would be the change. The buildings get even larger as the lots get larger too. So it's a question of, we've always had in the past the variance request if you wanted to build a 2-story building, which allowed for the potential to build this 2-story building in a historical district area, which would be adequately, because there would have been barns and that type of thing, and that's the reason why that was allowed.
Mr. Gearboff, if I may, that would not be grounds for a variance. A variance has to show hardship with the property regardless of whether it fits the historic character of the neighborhood. You can't build a 2-story garage simply because you want one and because it fits the nature of the house. You have to have an actual hardship for having one, which would be the inability to place a second garage. In fact, we just denied a variance for that exact request.
And I will say that this city has done that in the past too, and granted that. I agree, the ZBA shouldn't be granting a lot of things, but I also know that a recent ZBA proposal was being told that they didn't need to worry about height because this was going to be passed with this statement that we were no longer going to worry about height of up to 24 foot. That was, again, a statement made before this was even passed by council, which I have a concern when we're doing this kind of stuff that isn't following a clear pattern. It's kind of being brought up all of a sudden after the fact, or because someone reads something, and this has to happen. We have to have these discussions. It's not to kill the thing, but this is a major change. It affects the entire community, not just the R2 area, similar to when we were talking about the rentals union. That expanded into all rental properties because we knew that was going to be an issue related to discrimination, but that was never the original intention. It was to be just multiple units. So I'm trying to make sure that we follow policy and procedure and discuss these issues. So this battle's gone back and forth, and I understand this may look like we have to go back a few steps, and staff isn't not really happy about it, but this is how we work. We develop policy, and policy has to be discussed.
I have a question. Are we talking about buildings to live in or just extra buildings?
The only district that this ordinance that you currently recommended approval would allow to be lived in is in the R2 district. However, we also modified our accessory structure standards as it's shared in this memo, as shared in my presentation. So, yeah, yes, you could live in these buildings in the R2 district potentially, provided that you follow the ADU ordinance, but in all other districts in the community, it just allows you to have effectively a taller garage if that was something you chose to build. And it's a taller detached garage because our attached structures are already allowed to be 35 feet in height. You can have an attached garage at 35 feet in height already.
But am I understanding that this would change R1 to allow an additional structure?
No, this allows the same structure that currently, it allows the structure to be up to 10 feet taller. That was the only change effectively made with this, but other than that, it remains the same.
And I'm sorry if I'm being dense, but is currently the case in R1 that you can do an accessory structure up to?
You can do it, so yes, on page 3 of the edited, the ordinance excerpts, the only word that they took out there is garage, but effectively remains the same. So it could be a pergola, but you can't live in the structure regardless unless it's in the R2 district. You can currently have up to, on a lot over 12,000 square feet, a structure that's 840 square feet, and then one that is less than 200 square feet. So that principally has stayed the same, but now that structure that's 840 square feet could be 2 stories or 24 feet in height.
What's the minimum lot size for R2?
I would have to look that up real quick. I already have it up, so it should take less than a second. The minimum lot size for R2 is 9,800 square feet.
How much?
9,800
Okay.
square feet.
And I guess while we're at it, for R1?
R1, single family is 20,000. R1A, which is where the majority of our homes are in the city, however, that's also our common PUD district, is 11,700 square feet. R1B is 9,100, and then R1C is 7,800. There are nonconformities in some of these lots. R2, for example, has a lot of nonconformities given its historic nature.
And one other thing I've been confused about, what is the current setback requirement? Commissioner Gerbach has expressed some concern about the potential proximity of a new ADU versus a structure across a lot line on another property. What is the setback?
The current setback for all detached accessory structures is 3 feet. However, because of state building code, they have to be 10 feet apart from another structure. So it has to be, if your neighbor has one that's 3 feet from the property line, your structure would then have to be 7 feet from the property line.
Additional discussion?
Well, understanding that code review doesn't set policy, are there other implications that we possibly did not consider that code review has flagged?
Not to my knowledge. And like I said, this wasn't something that code review flagged. This was something that the city council
Okay.
thought there was not adequate discussion on.
Dean, are you concerned with the 2-story issue?
Well, I'm concerned that if we, the issue is going to be is that there's a push to put this into R1, and so that you could now build a garage in preparation for, if this passes, that you could build a garage in preparation for that to happen. My bigger worry is that the other aspect is, even though you say ZBA is going to deny it, we know ZBA has approved variances in the past based upon emotion and not based on actual, rules. And so if we're going to do this, we all agree that R2 is fine to do this in, and we kind of approached it that way. I just don't want to start rolling out something into R1 that doesn't necessarily, was never considered by council or even by this planning commission to be part of that review. We always talked about, we wanted to see how this would work in R2 because there are historical homes. People are already adjusted to the fact that those homes are allowed to be split into apartments, or they could have a separate building, so you have 2 families on those lots.
That's not true, Mr. Gearwald. They could never have been separate buildings. They had to be attached to family units. You can't have two single separate buildings on an R2
Two
lot.
apartments in those buildings, though.
Correct, but I'm just making sure we're all speaking on the same page. You could never have previously had two separate dwellings on an R2 property. It had to be a single dwelling attached.
I agree with that, and if I misspoke, I correct myself on that.
So you can't have a carriage house?
Not currently until this ordinance, if this ordinance is passed, that would allow and permit a carriage house or this accessory dwelling unit only in the R2 district.
And the reason this came about is because someone requested a garage be converted before we had this, and the ZBA made many mistakes in allowing the carriage house to proceed forward without proper, an ordinance like what we're trying to develop. And as a result, now we're trying to plug a hole that basically was opened, and we're trying to make sure what we're doing is going to be adequate. And I know there's a big push because everybody wants to go for density and other issues. It's like, we need to try and roll this out before we decide to turn every lot in town into a potential two-resident or a two-resident facility, or a homestead, I guess I want to say.
So regarding R1, is the concern being that people will build non-dwelling structures in anticipation of making them dwelling structures?
Because I know of examples where individuals have purchased homes thinking that they're going to be able to put an office and a bathroom and use that facility for that purpose, especially the barns and such in R1 areas, that then they find out they can't do that. But now they could be able to build that building, and then it's, how soon are we going to then now make a potential allowing it in an R1, or where we're going to all of a sudden face a bunch of potential, variance requests to allow them to do that. My thing, though, it gets back to what is a proper distance, even though they say 10 feet is appropriate. Is there something that we should do if we're going to allow these out throughout the whole R1 area and the whole city? Does that seem adequate for a setback? And how many buildings, now we're going to allow two large buildings, potentially if you have a two-story house, even another large building on a very small lot. Is that a concern, or is that not a concern? And is there a fire issue? What would be that? And I've never really seen any indication about what, at this point in time, indicates what's a reasonable amount of property to be covered. I know they talk about impervious surface is not an issue because you're just raising the building. But again, it's another large building that's potentially going to have issues related to sunlight. It's going to have issues about how it affects the property next door to it. All of that we've never counted on that in the past. So this is now a whole new look that we start allowing individuals to build these large buildings. What's the impact on the the quality of life for the other individuals that live next to those properties?
Well, what's the setback for a principal structure in R2?
So a principal structure in R2, the front yard setback is 25 feet, the side setback minimum is 10 feet, and then the rear setback is 50 feet.
So now you could build a new garage, a building, if you have a two-story building that's less than 24 feet, or 24 feet, 10 foot from the existing building, and then, as you said, if it's 7 feet from the next door neighbor, only 3 feet on this lot. I mean, these buildings could be very close together.
It can't
based on
be,
the current setback.
but they couldn't be less than 10 feet together, like the principal structure.
Correct, that is also correct. And again, I would reiterate that we had 15 and 23 years, despite the fact that I could have had an attached garage and built an additional detached garage. And then I would also add that there are lot coverage considerations too. Structures cannot occupy more than 30% of a lot. So doing some quick math, on an 8,000 square foot lot, that gives you about 2,400 feet to work with. So if I put an 840 square foot garage on that, a 720 square foot garage on that, that brings me down to about 1,600 square feet, which would then be split between my house and then potentially another shed. But if I have a 1,600 square foot house and then I'm already maxed at that 720, I can't have that third structure really unless it was like a prefabbed 80 square foot shed. So I think there's just another consideration to think about too, that we have other metrics to also prevent total proliferation of large structures essentially.
And just for my clarification, when we, not tabled this, but whenever we decided to push this back, it was to make sure that we were having more people from the Planning Commission. We actually are down 4 tonight.
3.
3 tonight. So that's also to be noted. I mean, I know Mr. Beardsley always has good comments about it, and he wasn't here last time. The mayor is not here. Commissioner Heft is not here, too. So I don't know what additional comments would come from them. From what you had just discussed about the setbacks and the math, because I like math, it makes sense to me why the numbers were chosen the way that they were. It's a little concerning that the 24 feet in height was not discussed from the Carlisle-Wortman memo. It was included in the ordinance. It's not like that's something that's changed since March, whenever we discussed this. I personally have no problems with this. If we've pulled so few permits, I inherently see the good in people. And I know that's not always the way that people are. But I don't think we're going to have 1 million people that decide that they want to have 2 homesteads on their structure, on their lot. So I will still be voting in favor of this ordinance.
My recommendation would be is that we move this to just simply be an R2 for a test trial, and not necessarily expand it. And Mr. Harrington had mentioned that we can do that at this point in time, so that it does not necessarily implement into the entire community. This was similar to what the density issue that came up, and full council was not happy with that because they felt that that was not properly vetted and informed of the community to understand what that impact was going to be. We keep talking about transparency, and we want to keep making sure this information is proceeding out there. Again, if this group decides that, I mean, my motion would be is to move this forward, but that it be limited to the R2.
I think also we could consider just single-story additional units. I realize that, you know, if you have a 2-story house, you don't need a 2-story accessory unit. That is an awful lot.
But what if it's existing? What if it's an existing 2-story garage that has a crawl space up above? Is that grandfathered in? We don't have to worry?
If it's illegally non-conforming, then yes. I guess I'm confused, Mr. Carroll. Are you saying for all, including the R2, that we should now go back and limit it down to just the?
No, just for new permits.
Okay, but this ordinance was also designed to allow them in the R2 district. And part of the principle of that, too, was understanding that in order to maximize that space, because a lot of the R2 homes specifically have detached garages, they would have to be 24 feet in height to both accommodate an ADU and then potentially still an area for the person to store their vehicle. So that was the principal part of the ordinance, and that's what Mr. Gearbaugh was saying, is you could limit just R2, but is your recommendation that we scrap that all together and go back to the existing 14 feet in height?
For new units only, not for current. Obviously, you can't ask a person to tear down a unit.
Right, so that would be what our current standard is that they cannot be taller than 14 feet.
If I could, the reason why I think we want to allow it in the R2, and because if we allow it in the R2, you could then build a new garage with, above that garage, you could then have that auxiliary unit. Where it is in the R1, it would really still just continue to be what we currently have in the policy, and then as we find out what's happening in the R2, it could either be changed or rolled out. It's just, I don't think we want to limit in the R2 the height of those buildings because, again, a number of those homes that we have already identified have garages or barns, and we don't necessarily want to discourage that type of structure within the historical district because it would be representative of what would have been there prior. It does encourage the idea of, you know, having an auxiliary building that would provide for income so those homes can be maintained in the historic. That's one of the reasons why I was supportive of the R2 area, because the majority of those homes are historical. Before they get destroyed, you could allow them to have an option of being able to either convert the house into 2 apartments, or they could actually build another auxiliary building, keeping one single family, and then allowing another one the other one, but not necessarily dissuade them from being able to have a garage plus a building on top. Right now, we have an example that was just presented to ZBA where they want to have a garage where they can park 3 cars in it and then still be able to have storage on the top, I believe.
I think they were going to have it wasn't going to be a full level. It was going to be potentially stairs at most.
But again, it would have had an issue because then they were going to put a cupola and everything on the height on it. So it's kind of trying to figure out how to best handle this in a, what I would say, in a test mode before we roll it out to the entire community and make such a big change. I mean, Mr. Harrington may be correct that there haven't been very many that garage requested, but I do know garages have been built, but they've always been built because we've always told them you can't build it higher than 14 feet. So this is now a change that would now allow people to do that. I know an example of my own, and full disclosure, my brother's barn garage caught fire. He can't build it any higher than 14 feet. If this passes, he could now immediately build a two-story garage, and he would like to do that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have to go into a variance at the time. So I'm giving a prime example of what could happen going forward is that, yeah, neighbors across the street tore their garage down a year ago and put a new garage up. So it's not like this won't happen. It's just currently we have things in place that prevent the building of these larger structures, which could potentially then turn into an auxiliary dwelling unit.
Mr. Giroux, if I may, if I had an attached garage on my house, so I already had the space, and I'm permitted still to have a detached accessory structure on my lot. So I have room for my car. I live in Huntington Woods. Well, Huntington Woods isn't a great example because they have an HOA. But why would I not then build the detached accessory structure that's 1 story, 840 square feet, add a spur on my driveway to it, voila, it's now a single-story accessory dwelling unit?
Right.
Do you see the logic there, at least, that if I did that, it's the same incentive as if I had a detached garage and built it in a second story? That I could already effectively do the same thing now that you're saying that is going to happen as a result of this?
Correct, but you can't put a second floor on it at 24 feet.
Well, right, but your fear is that people in the R1 are going to build things in preparation for the ADU. Because, and I guess, I don't know if it's the height or the concern that we might not want to roll this out to the R1 districts, but if the concern is we might not want to roll this out to the R1 districts and we don't want to give people the edge on potentially doing it and then starting to request variances, well, in reality, they already could. If that was really their intent, they could have an attached garage and then build on their 12,000 square foot lot an 840 square foot standalone structure and then use that in preparation for an accessory dwelling unit. That would be perfectly within our code and to build that secondary structure.
Right, but they can only use it as a storage facility.
Or just as how they could use a garage that would be of this height. They could only use it as a storage facility, as how this ordinance is written at the moment.
So this ordinance does not allow additional living facility?
In the R1, R1A, R1B, R1C,
R2.
R3A, and R3 district, only the R2.
This would allow to have second floors on
Right.
unit buildings now that we don't currently allow.
Right, the discussion really focuses on, was the planning commission aware of the provision that would allow garages to be 24 feet in height, or the height of the house, whichever is less, in all districts, not just the R2. That was fundamentally why we wanted to bring the discussion back, to make sure that you're cognizant of that. And if there's objection to it, if you think it needs additional consideration, we can then postpone it at the next council meeting and bring it back to planning, or we can recommend that planning or city council take it up as an action item themselves.
Is there any other effect on R1 than to increase the maximum height from 14 feet to potentially 24?
The only other effect is that previously we had language in there specifically that this larger accessory structure had to be a garage. We've taken that out. So if you wanted to use it as a pergola, if you wanted a massive pergola in your backyard or a massive detached deck, that would not be permissible. But other than that, no, there are no other changes. And I would again reiterate that most of the homes in our community at this point in time have attached garages, not detached garages.
To be clear, if this is adopted, then the large pergola or deck, well, I don't know, the pergola would be permissible in R1.
That is correct. Yeah, right. It would just be that we're no longer discriminating based on garage rather than the pergola, essentially.
So speaking of that, so basically you can build any kind of facility, any kind of structure now, because there's no definition as to what that structure is. So what would be?
We have a definition for accessory structure. I could pull it up for you.
But I mean, but you're saying pergola, or it could be a garage, or it could be a storage facility, or it could be a studio, or whatever.
Chicken coop.
Chicken coop, but that's a little smaller. But it could be considered like they do a he shed, she shed, man shed, any of that kind of stuff.
Provided it meets the criteria of our ordinance, yes.
And those buildings, if they're finished in the interior?
It would really depend on the building, I guess.
Well, my question is, when those garages are generally they may be drywalled or something like that because they're finished, but if it then starts becoming something of like a secondary room, not necessarily, and being used as some type of auxiliary space.
There are a lot of building codes they would have to comply with if they intended to occupy the space for a means other than storage.
I assume we would not issue a building permit that's for residential occupancy.
That is correct.
It's unfortunate we don't understand why the city, in the past history, I don't understand why they went to just one-story garages, although I think it was because of the concern of the impact that you would have with a two-story building on the backyard of an adjacent house, and I believe that's probably what the reason was behind it.
And if I may, most of our zoning code comes from the year 1968. Our lot standards come from 1968. Our units per acre standards come from 1968. It's a very common practice. I mean, to share my expertise in planning, this is how suburbs chose to adopt zoning codes. They largely pulled from one another. Carlisle Wortman has since the 90s largely emulated our code with Dexter's code. They're more or less the same at this point in a lot of different respects. Cities borrow from other cities, and there's not a lot of science behind it, and that's particularly an issue with lot standards in terms of width and setbacks, et cetera. But I don't know if there's necessarily any rhyme or reason for it other than this is what people did in 1968 as planning practices.
So Dexter and Chelsea and other communities around here all allow 24-foot high garages?
I can't tell you that specifically. I believe Dexter does at this time because they've just adopted an ADU ordinance, and I believe that they also use the approach, the same one that Carlisle Wortman recommended to us, which is to modify our entire accessory structure standards and not just looking at the one specific district.
Is Dexter expanding their whole ADU to cover the entire city, or just?
I would have to ask the Dexter staff.
Is there additional discussion?
Well, I'm curious what we're actually supposed to be doing here. It's just a discussion item. Are we supposed to give to you our sense as to whether we want to have yet another meeting with an action item to recommend?
Yes.
And if our informal sense is we don't want that, then council would just continue and the matter would not come back to us?
That is correct.
I don't know what the procedure is right now either. Do I ask people? Do we want to go down the line?
I think just kind of having an idea, if the majority of you think that we need to do that, that's 3 and 3, so it's not ideal for this either.
Well, is there any particular urgency to council considering this? I mean, I have just some concerns that we didn't consider certain things. There are, issues that have been expressed at this meeting that whether or not I ultimately would agree with them, maybe haven't been vetted. And we, once again, don't have really a full complement here, although I doubt that will be the case the rest of the summer.
Right, I think that would be, I would like to see it again if I would like, essentially I'm asking, do you want to stand by that recommendation you made, or would you now, in light of this information, or not, if you saw that in the ordinance, do you want to bring it back and discuss it again? Either way is fine. To Mr. Gearbaugh's point, sometimes it does take longer to develop policy. So if this is the preference of the Planning Commission, then yes, we will bring it back.
Yeah, I overall just have a sense of discomfort standing by the recommendation we made. There's clearly things we didn't consider. It might be that the end result is the same. But from a procedural perspective, to me, there's too much sort of disorganization at the moment as to how we've handled this. And since council has specifically asked what our preference is, that would be mine. Although I will just state, if it's 2 weeks from now, I won't be here, so.
No, we won't have a first meeting in July. It will be pushed to the 26th.
Good. So I can't speak for others, but that is my sense.
Mr. Carroll?
I guess there's a couple issues. First of all, we talk about accessory dwelling units, which I think should actually be stricken because we're not talking about dwelling, we're talking about additional
But Mr.
units for storage and other units.
In the R2 district, the whole ordinance is based around accessory dwelling units. So the accessory structure standards are changing, and that's the specific provision that the council think we missed in this discussion was that. But by and large, the ordinance really focuses on accessory dwelling units. So it's one provision of this larger ordinance.
Well, then I think we should emphasize this is R2 only,
Okay.
period.
Well, I think the issue is that, well, where is the accessory structure change? Is that within the ADU ordinance, or is it somewhere else?
It's within the accessory structure ordinance, so it applies to everything, not just ADUs.
Okay. And so to be clear, is this in the memo we got on March 17th? Is the language in here from the accessory structure ordinance that's being changed?
Well, it's all the same ordinance. It's just.
Okay, sorry.
Which I know, so it's all the same code. So yes, it was featured in the red line version, it was featured in the full-length version, but it was missed in my report, and to Planner Auerbach's credit, or whatever, it's not exactly clear in his statement here, detached ADUs may be up to 24 feet in height. In reality, all detached accessory structures may be up to 24 feet in height. So we're just clarifying that that's essentially the issue here.
Okay, and then follow up with Dan's point, what I'm understanding is when we refer to an ADU, we are definitely referring to a habitable space. But in the context of this ordinance, we would redefine accessory structure for all residential districts, and that is the source of the
Yes.
concern, that we didn't, this was discussed by us as an R2 issue, but there is an R1 implication, or all
There-
of them
yes.
are designations. Okay, thank you.
It's with consideration of this item, I did understand the item when I read through it, that it was part of the ordinance the first time that we voted on it. So my feeling is that I would vote in the same way. However, it does bring me concern that other folks on the commission were not aware, especially those that may not be here in attendance this evening. So I think that should be taken into consideration as well.
Mr. Gerber?
My thing was, I just recommend the council that because of this concern, and I know I'm the one that's proposing this, but it's that it should come back, let us feel comfortable that we discussed it through fully. The recommendation is then to proceed with it as is, or any other adjustments. It comes cleanly from planning. Council no longer has to question that concern. So my recommendation is similar to what my colleagues are saying, is that it should just be a recommendation to come back and be a full-fledged decision be made at whatever the next available or scheduled meeting that we have that Mr. Harrington feels appropriate.
Mr. Postic?
I would concur with Dean on that, but I think we should restrict it to the R2. See how it plays out.
Okay, so listening to the commission and through our discussion, we've decided, it seems that we'd like to review this again fully with more members of the commission here, so that we can have a concurrence and see if we would still vote in the same or a different manner.
Right. So it will come back to you as an action item at the next meeting then, which is July 26th. There will not be a July 12th meeting.
Everybody okay with that?
I am.
Excellent. All right, continuing on. Do we have a motion to excuse the absences of Beardsley, Marl, and Heft?
So moved.
Second?
All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Does anybody like to adjourn the meeting at 7:38? Second. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Thank you.